Hey everyone, so today we're going to go through sort of land use planning from an environmental consulting perspective. The first thing that is up is phase one ESAs, which are environmental site assessments. Anytime a commercial property is bought or sold or refinanced, a phase one ESA is required. Generally, what that is it's basically a historical activity report where an environmental professional such as myself will go back and gather a bunch of evidence and information on this property for as far back in time as we can go. And we'll look at all the different pieces and kind of develop a site history and determine whether or not this site is potentially impacted that would make it environmentally hazardous for the site occupants, so the people who are going to be using it, or if it's, if it used to be a toxic waste dump and it never got closed properly, and now there's potential for leachate to be released into the stream that's out back or something like that. So a phase one is where you uncover all of those sort of liabilities that are associated with a property based on the historical use. So when you do discover these sorts of things, they come in a few categories, a few flavors. So we call those RECs, or recognized environmental conditions. What a recognized environmental condition is essentially evidence of something that could negatively impact the environment or site occupants. There's a standard for it. It's called the ASTM 1527-13. It was developed in 2013, and essentially it is a rule book with definitions and different things that are required as part of a phase one ESA. So a REC, a recognized environmental condition, is something that is currently at the property. If it's a auto body shop with a bunch of oil on the ground going into a floor drain, that is a REC. That is something that we saw in our site visit. That's something that we can point to and say, look, this is potentially going into a storm drain, going and releasing into the environment. This is a recognized environmental condition that exists at the site. Other RECs involve leaking underground storage tanks. They can involve different sort of hazardous materials, poor handling practices. If you see a shop that is using a ton of solvents or petroleum products that is just sloppy and it's all over the ground, then you can say that that's a REC. Another REC is, say, next door, there used to be historically a dry cleaner. Dry cleaners use chlorinated solvents that can get into the groundwater and become vapor intrusion risks and things like that. A REC is the presence or likely presence of any hazardous substance or petroleum product in, on, or at a property. Any release to the environment under conditions indicative of a release to environment, or under conditions that pose material threat or of future release. So that's a REC. There's also an HREC, which is a past release that has been cleaned up, that has been given the okay by the regulatory body that oversees it. So, say across the street, I used to have a gas station. They had a leaking fuel tank underground that got excavated, all the soil got taken up and it was cleaned up. The county gave it the stamp of approval. Now it's an apartment complex. That would be an HREC, a historic recognized environmental condition, something that was existing that has now been cleaned up. And then there's also a CREC, which is a controlled recognized environmental condition, which is essentially, let's just use the same gas station scenario. So across the street was a gas station, now it's an apartment complex. They realized that there was some fuel there. They couldn't clean it all up, so they left some in place, but because it was maybe motor oil or something, they paved over the entire place. So it's all asphalt parking lot now. And there's no way that the site occupants could dig into the ground and get oil in their mouths or on their hands. So that capping is what we call it. That asphalt cover is now a controlled REC, because it's a recognized environmental condition that has now been controlled, and the threats to the on-site occupants have been mitigated. So those are our flavors. There's also when it comes to solvents and groundwater and things like that, they can vaporize and come up through the concrete slab in the floor and pose inhalation risks to site occupants. So that's called a vapor intrusion concern, which is not in this definition of the ASTMs. Right now, they're developing a new 2021 edition that's going through all the review processes, but they're going to add most likely a vapor intrusion concern, which is a known vapor plume traveling beneath a property that is off-gassing, vapor intruding into the property, or a vapor encroachment concern, VEC, which is where a plume maybe travels near a property. It's been documented on the property across the street, may or may not be on this property. So it's a potential vapor encroachment concern, but we don't know if the vapor is coming into the slab or coming into the building to impact the occupants. But that being said, since those aren't in the manuals yet, I'm not going to ask you about the vapor intrusion, vapor encroachment ones. I'll probably have a question on the quiz about what is a REC, what is an HREC, and what is a CREC. And you'll have to go through and let me know what those are. So here we go. Basically, with environmental, with phase 1 ESAs, as I said, we do a historical activity report on properties. We try and get as much evidence about the former use, current use of that property to get an idea of how it could be impacted, how it could be negatively impacted, and how that could affect site occupants or future use. So here's a site that we have in San Francisco. One of our lines of evidence is aerial photographs. So we'll take a look at our property. This is 93, but it's basically what it looks like now. We've got apartments down here. We've got our streets. We've got our little apartment here. You can see that there's not a whole lot of detail on this map, but we get an idea that, this is how things look now. So then we go back to our historic aerials and we see, okay, here's our property. Things look generally the same. Oh, look, down here a block away. This is a big cemetery right here. So cemeteries, if there's a shallow groundwater table, can be an issue. If the groundwater is traveling this way and going underneath our property, there's a lot of organic chemicals and basically what they use in the embalming fluids to preserve bodies. So if you see a cemetery that's nearby your property, that's something to be concerned with. If the groundwater travels beneath our property and we see this cemetery here, we know that there is a potential that embalming fluids could have leached out of these decomposing bodies into the groundwater table, and it could be impacting our property. It could be a vapor intrusion concern, or it could be a recognized environmental condition. So we keep going through. We take a look, like, oh, look, it's in the 40s. It was taken out. In the 50s, look, oh, it was turned into this apartment complex that we see now. So for this particular site, that's something that we're thinking about. Okay, nearby there was a very large cemetery that could be traveling, that could have leached contaminants into the groundwater that could be affecting our property. So that's what we got out of the aerials. Let's move on. Another important thing that we look at are Sanborn fire insurance maps. They don't usually make these so much anymore, but they were super helpful for old things, especially in large cities like San Francisco. Here's our property here. We're looking at 1883. So at that point, our property wasn't even built yet. This is a pretty sparsely populated area. We can see that there's like a roundabout for horse carriages here, a turntable. We can see some little houses. So this lets us know that the 1 here tells us this is a single story. The D tells us that it's a dwelling. So it's just, these are residential houses. We keep looking, not much has changed. There's a few other developments in 1899, 1913. Let's take a look. Looks like I highlighted some things here. So here's our property. It's been developed. There's 2 flats, 2 floors, 2 flats. So we know back in 1913, somewhere between 1899 and 1913, our property was developed. So we would go and look at building records from the city to determine when exactly that was built. And we know that it was 2 flats. There's a store on this side. Looks like this building wasn't yet built yet. Looks like over here, this is fine. There's some flats, there's some stores, but look right here. We've got a Chinese laundry 3 doors down from our unit. Across the street, we've got an auto repair shop, and then also we've got a French laundry. So these are, and then down here we've even got another dry cleaner. So we've got 3 dry cleaners, 3 laundries, dry cleaners, just on the same block as our apartment. So like I said, they use a lot of organic chlorinated solvents, PCE, TCE. Those things can often were spilled or thrown into the sanitary sewers. So if there was a sewer line running down the middle of this road up here to the right, then we would potentially have a vapor intrusion concern for our apartment, for our house right here. So we keep looking. Yes, auto is still there. The 3 dry cleaners are still there. We've got another garage, and it looks like we've got another cleaners. So we've got 4 cleaners right here, and we've got 2 garages all within a block of our property. So we've got the former. So just right now, what our concerns are: we've got the 4 laundries that are near our property. They've been there for at least 50 years. So that's a long history, a lot of potential for spills and contamination. And plus just the longevity of these, we've got a lot of potential for accumulated spills. On top of that, we've also got down here to the south, we have now it's a bunch of houses, but back in the day, we know that it was a cemetery, which could also have impacted our property. So those are 2 things that we're thinking about, just based on the aerials and the Sanborn Fire Insurance maps. The next thing we do is we put in a bunch of requests to the city building department, the environmental health department, the fire department, all these different things to say like, hey, do you have any documents? It's a Freedom of Information Act public records request. We put that in. They respond with anything they have for the property to let us know, like, oh yeah, there was a heating oil tank there. Or, they used to have a bunch of hazardous materials that were documented as being delivered and taken out. That gives you an idea of what the former use of the property was, anything that could have happened on site or even nearby. You can do a public records request for those laundries or those units, those adjoining properties or any property you want, just to see what was there at some point in history. So we did that for this property. A lot of properties in San Francisco and larger cities had heating oil tanks back in the day. So that's what came up here. We've got this in 1995. We've got a heating oil tank was there, 550 gallons. It had gasoline. So basically what they did was they excavated it. They removed the tank, they removed the soil, and then they tested the soil, which is what you want to do to make sure that there's no remaining contamination in place. Like say that tank corroded and started to leak the gas into the ground. You want to know that soil has all been removed and out of there before you redevelop it. That would be a liability. That would be a recognized environmental condition. But we can see that they did some soil samples. They did the middle of the tank pit and they did the soil stockpile. We can see that it was non-detect for gas, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes. Those are the constituents of gas. VOC, constituents of gas that are common and are also carcinogenic. So we can see that they did what they were supposed to do. They removed it, they sampled the soil, and it was all clean. They did some groundwater sampling, and it looks like it was just soil here. So it's just soil. They didn't get to groundwater. But they found that the soil was clean, so that's good. We can see where the excavation was, where the tank was, where the soil was, and all of that. So let's see. Here's another property. I just want to show you. I think these are really cool. This is the downtown San Jose, Berryessa Road. basically all of San Jose, all of Silicon Valley used to be orchards at one point. So we always look at these old aerials. We find this is our property now. It's a commercial building. I think it was a dentist's office, but it and everything surrounding it was orchards. This was back in 1939. Here we go, 1940, still orchards. 1950, still orchards. Still orchards. 1956, still orchards, kind of declining in use. Here we go. By 1970s, it's all been, there's some relic orchards over here, but pretty much everything's been redeveloped. So in order to develop these big tracts of neighborhoods, they had to do phase ones. They had to test the soil, because with orchards and any kind of agricultural use, there's the possibility that pesticides or pesticides, fertilizer, that kind of thing was used at the property. So they do a soil test to make sure that the soil's clean and those things aren't there. Otherwise, they have to then remediate it, which in the case of former agricultural sites is usually an excavation, because it's usually only in the top foot or two of the soil column, because they're all applied at the surface. And they don't tend to leach too much down, except for if you have got old school DDT, DDE, those catastrophic ones that took out the peregrine falcon and things like that. Those are long lived in the environment, which is also something you would test for. Let's see here. So again, back to the environmental records. This is something we got from the fire marshal for one of our properties, and it turns out back in the day, like currently it's a taqueria, a Mexican restaurant, but back in the day it was a cleaners back in the 60s. And then upon further investigation, we found this hand-drawn map that showed that, there used to be dryers. Here's a boiler room, and look, there was a UST in the back. We had no records of the UST being removed. UST is an underground storage tank. So this was a fuel tank with a gas pump. So the owner of this cleaners would drive their truck up here and fill it up. During the oil shortages in the 70s, it's not uncommon. A lot of businesses bought and installed their own fuel tanks, because there was such a scare that there's going to be long lines at the gas pump. There's going to be shortages. So tons of people put in these underground storage tanks. And a lot of them weren't regulated, weren't permitted, and weren't properly removed. So with this site, we found that this gas tank was indeed still in the ground. So we ended up having to go and remove that, excavate it, excavate a bunch of extra soil, test the groundwater, and do the whole thing. So that is a brief, not so brief introduction into phase ones. The next step in the process is phase two, which is kind of like what I was discussing, is the subsurface investigation. So basically what that is going to the property and assessing what is there. If it was something simple like a tank or pesticides, then you can pesticides, you kind of do a grid pattern and just sample the upper soil for pesticides, metals, things like that. For a tank, you would go to the location where the tank was, you drill down and you test the soil beneath the bottom of where you think the tank was, so maybe 8 to 10 feet. You grab a water sample in case it sank down into the water table. If you have a dry cleaner across the street, then you would do a similar sort of thing. You would drill down and take some soil and groundwater samples. You would also want, because of the vapor, you would also want to do a vapor assessment, which is where you put a probe into the soil, right beneath the slab or deep or into the soil, and you basically hook up a little can, a 1 liter can that has been evacuated of all the air, so it's under vacuum pressure, and then you put a probe in the ground and hook a hose up to it, and that vacuum will just start sucking in the air that's down there. And then you analyze the air, and you can tell if there's gas or solvents, chlorinated hydrocarbon solvents, something like that, or chlorinated organic compounds that VOCs that are potentially off-gassing from the water, or or just stuck in the vadose zone in the soil. That's the soil pore space beneath your building. If there's some sort of VOCs in there, they can come up and come through the slab and impact the indoor air. If that's the case, then the next step would be to then set canisters inside to sample the indoor air. And then if you find contamination, then the next step is, to remediate it, to remediate it or mitigate it. Remediate is to clean up. To mitigate it is to basically nip it in the bud, stop the potential for people to get sick or harmed from it. So a mitigation measure might be to put epoxy coating on the floor so that none of those vapors can come up through the floor. A remediation would be to install an extraction system, which is essentially pipes underneath the building that suck out the air and pump it through carbon vessels to clean it. That would be a remedial effort because you're actively cleaning up the contamination, whereas a mitigation effort, you're just preventing it from doing harm. So yeah, that's a little bit about phase 1 and phase 2 assessments. We're right about 20 minutes here, so I'm going to stop. But yeah, that's the next step is remediation, and we'll get into that a little bit more. I've got some videos that I've done earlier that I'll post here as well. Okay.